Well, if we haven't met properly, my name is Abby. I'm normally up here more like Lucy and Liam at the start and the end of the gatherings, and then I can kind of escape off to the sides in the middle. So it's a little more daunting to be up here at this point, but it is a real privilege to have the opportunity to share something from the Bible with you this evening. For those of you wondering where I've kind of appeared from, where I've come from, I moved to Sheffield for university nearly 8 years ago now, and then I'm one of those ones who's stayed on ever since so far. After university, I did a year with what was known as the STC College then, now becoming the intern year. And then for a few years, I worked in autism specialist student support alongside a day a week on the team here. And then since January, I've had the joy of working on the staff team here a bit more and currently help to oversee some of the young adult stuff here. So that's just a little snapshot of me. If you've been around the last few weeks in the evenings, you'll know that we've had an amazingly different couple of Sundays. So a couple of Sundays ago, we were down at St. Thomas, Philadelphia. Then last week, we celebrated Pentecost, had Mike Rutter came to share a message with us. But before that, we had kind of kicked off this new series at the 7 p.m. gatherings looking at Philoxenia, Grace in an Age of Cancel Culture. And so this is where we're kind of picking up this week again. So this word Philoxenia, or Philoxenia, we're not quite sure which is right, is the Greek word for hospitality, and it carries sort of a combination of two meanings. One of this sort of brotherly, sisterly type of love, and then the other is a description of people who are strangers or foreigners. And so sort of putting these together, the hospitality that the Bible talks about, that we see in the Bible, is when we treat outsiders and those who aren't like us or have different values and beliefs to us with the same sort of affection as we would those who are closest to us and those who are most like us. And so we're using Sunday evenings to explore this radical sort of hospitality and what we can learn from different examples of seeing Jesus do this in the Gospels, because we really want to learn what it looks like to show grace in a culture where it's so easy to block out voices that we don't agree with. It can be so easy to cancel people that we're different to. And I think the big thing for me, as we've started to sort of unpack this, is just realising afresh that actually to show grace better, we have got to capture something more of the heart of Jesus. And so it's kind of along this theme that I want to unpack a bit more this evening. So the passage that we are in today is Luke chapter 7, verses 36 to 50. I'll read those for us now. They may appear on the screen, but I've just realised I didn't check, so that's my fault if they don't. But you might have a Bible that you want to follow along with as well. So Luke chapter 7, verses 36 to 50. Now, one of the Pharisees invited Jesus to have dinner with him, so he went to the Pharisee's house and reclined at the table. When a woman who had lived a sinful life in that town learned that Jesus was eating at the Pharisee's house, she bought an alabaster jar of perfume. And as she stood behind him at his feet weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears. Then she wiped them with her hair, kissed them, and poured perfume on them. When the Pharisee who had invited him saw this, he said to himself, "If this man were a prophet, he would know who is touching him and what kind of woman she is, that she is a sinner." Jesus answered him, "Simon, I have something to tell you." "Tell me, teacher," he said. 2 men owed money to a certain moneylender. One owed him 500 denarii and the other 50. Neither of them had the money to pay him back, so he cancelled the debts of both. "Now, which of them will love him more?" Simon replied, "I suppose the one who had the bigger debt cancelled." "You have judged correctly," Jesus said. Then he turned toward the woman and said to Simon, "Do you see this woman? I came into your house. You did not give me any water for my feet, but she wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You did not give me a kiss, but this woman from the time I entered has not stopped kissing my feet. You did not put oil on my head, but she has poured perfume on my feet. Therefore, I tell you, her many sins have been forgiven, for she loved much. But he who has been forgiven little loves little." Then Jesus said to her, "Your sins are forgiven." The other guests began to say among themselves, "Who is this who even forgives sins?" Jesus said to the woman, "Your faith has saved you. Go in peace." And the more I've sort of read and thought about this passage, particularly over the past couple of weeks, I'm really struck by what Jesus does here and what we can learn from how he treats the people around him. So like so much of Jesus' ministry, it takes place around the dinner table, which, praise God, we're also able to start doing a bit more now as restrictions are easing. And Jesus has been invited to Simon the Pharisee's house, and he's at the table when a woman who has a bit of a reputation as a sinful woman approaches Jesus, and she brings this sacrificial offering of worship to him, this alabaster jar of perfume. Now, Simon's a bit put out that Jesus welcomes her so freely. I think the implication is that he doesn't really think that she deserves forgiveness, and he also isn't sure that Jesus is the one who should be doing the forgiving. So what can we kind of learn from this about how Jesus shows hospitality and grace? Well, firstly, I'd love to think about the presence of Jesus in this passage. It would have been a bold move for the woman to approach Jesus in Simon the Pharisee's house. It was a social custom at that time that people in need could visit a banquet, probably like the one that was going on, to receive some of the leftovers. And so that might have been why the woman kind of chose that moment to approach Jesus. But still, it would have been a massive deal for her to go into the house of a religious leader when she carried this reputation of living a sinful life. The text kind of doesn't give the details, but many commentators think that would have involved sexual immorality, and so she would have been seen as an outcast in that society at the time. But there's something about Jesus' presence that, despite all this, despite the shame that she might have felt or could have been made to feel, she was drawn to approaching Jesus. And as she enters Jesus' presence, the tears start to flow. She's moved to kneel down and offer her worship. And she proceeds to honour Jesus in a way that would have been considered improper to the Pharisees around. At this point, I love that Jesus hadn't even uttered a word. He didn't need to say anything to convict her, to call out what was wrong. Actually, just being with Jesus, being in his presence, the woman was led to repentance and led to offer her worship to him. I have a friend who, I didn't know her before, but a couple of years ago, she came along to Alpha, and we were part of the same small group. And after starting the Alpha course, she'd come along a few Monday evenings. She started to come along on a Sunday as well to the evening gatherings. And for the first few weeks, she would come along and during the worship, she would just find that she was really emotional. And she kept sort of saying to me, "Abby, I don't know what's happening. I'm not normally like this. I don't normally cry so much. What's going on?" And I think she was just encountering something of the power of the presence of Jesus. And that was something she couldn't actually necessarily put into words on a Monday evening in our conversations and our discussions, but there was something about her encountering the presence of Jesus. And I think this made me realise that often we worry about having the right words to say to people or doing the right things to lead people to Jesus, when actually often it's just as simple as leading people into his presence and letting God, trusting God to do the rest. And of course, there are times when we might need to use words to challenge or to call something out, but I just really encourage us not to underestimate the power of inviting someone to just come before God and to pour out their worship to him in their own way. And so there's something about the presence of Jesus. And then I think there's something about the posture of Jesus here. We see in this passage that Jesus was comfortable in the presence of two extremes of people, really. Jesus is invited to the Pharisee's house, so he accepts the invitation. But we know from the rest of Luke and other accounts of the Gospels that Jesus didn't have the easiest relationship with the Pharisees. They were passionate about God and the Jewish faith, yet interpreted the Old Testament so rigidly that they were blind to who Jesus really was, and they actively kind of criticised his actions, seeking to catch him out. And in Matthew 23, Jesus repeatedly calls the Pharisees hypocrites for not living out what they were teaching. They wanted to kind of appear righteous and holy, but their actions kind of every day didn't back that up. And so from the outset, I think Jesus shows real grace in accepting the invitation into Simon's house to eat with him, because it wouldn't necessarily have been the most comfortable, the easiest situation for him to be in. And then this woman arrives, right on the other end of the religious spectrum, as it were, someone who would have been viewed as an outcast in society, and yet Jesus welcomes her too. Simon dismisses the woman right away. He's very clear that he doesn't think Jesus should be anywhere near her. She shouldn't be approaching Jesus. And yet that actually contradicted so much of Jesus' ministry and what he stood for in reaching out to the vulnerable, to the oppressed, to the marginalised. But as Simon writes the woman off, Jesus is still incredibly gracious and gently teaches Simon why he hasn't done that, why he has forgiven the woman. And I think where Jesus could have not engaged with Simon or chosen to kind of keep his distance for seeing things differently, for treating people differently, he chose to make the most of that opportunity. And in a very gentle, Jesus-like way that only he could do, he chose to engage, to not just check out, to still invest in Simon. And I think that's a real challenge for us today. Actually, can we be a bit too quick to judge or to disengage with people who we feel like are Pharisee-type people in our society today? And again, that's not to say that we don't hold people to account, that we don't stand up to injustice. But are we gracious in the way that we go about it? Do we follow the example of Jesus that we see here? Because I think Jesus' posture is one of grace. And then just in keeping with the letter P, I think there's also something about the person of Jesus. Jesus freely extends grace and forgiveness to Simon the Pharisee and to the woman because he knows who he is and he isn't swayed by the remarks of other people around him. Simon challenges if Jesus is really a prophet, and Jesus doesn't answer back. He doesn't feel the need, but I think ironically sort of demonstrated that he is by being able to tell what Simon was thinking. And when the other people around ask who Jesus is to forgive sins, he doesn't pay attention to them, but he focuses on the woman right in front of him, forgiving her sins because of her faith, rather than explaining or justifying why he was doing that. Jesus knew who he was and that he answered to God and to God alone. And so I think when it feels countercultural to show grace and forgiveness in a society that can be quick to disassociate from people, or that encourages us to write people off if they've done something wrong or we don't agree with them, we can be encouraged by Jesus' example here, that he got on with the task in hand, he got on with what was right in front of him, because his identity was secure in God. And then we get to the end of the passage, to verse 50, where Jesus says to the woman, "Your faith has saved you, go in peace." It's by her faith alone here that she receives grace and forgiveness from Jesus. It's not the love that she has shown him, not the sacrifice that she makes in pouring this jar of perfume over Jesus' feet. That's just what kind of overflows out of her heart when she approaches Jesus and she finds forgiveness in him. But it is by faith that she is saved. When the Sunday rota comes out for these gatherings, there's kind of a column for the Bible passage and the theme, and then the name of the person who's speaking next to it. And so for this week, the 30th of May, 2021, it said, "The Sinful Woman, Abby Murphy." And my initial reaction was I felt slightly offended. I thought, what's Tom trying to say? But then I thought, well, no, it's true. Abby Murphy is, I am a sinful woman. We are all sinful, broken people, whether we like to admit that very often or not. But we worship a very gracious God who, through Jesus on the cross, has offered forgiveness to us all. And I think it's only when we truly grasp that forgiveness and grace that has been given to us first that we are better able to show that grace towards others. I always find Jesus' example of the two people who owed money very convicting. So let me just read verses 41 and 42 to us again. Two men owed money to a certain moneylender. One owed him 500 denarii and the other 50. Neither of them had the money to pay him back, so he cancelled the debts of both. Now which of them will love him more? Simon replied, "I suppose the one who had the bigger debt cancelled." "You have judged correctly," Jesus said. And then in verse 47, Jesus goes on to say, "Therefore I tell you, her many sins have been forgiven, for she loved much. But he who has been forgiven little loves little." I think the big thing that kind of stands out to me here is that we can only truly show grace to others, like we see Jesus do in the passage, when we grasp God's grace that has been extended to us. We can only truly show grace to others when we grasp God's grace that has been extended to us. And so I'd just like to think about this a bit more for the rest of the time now. Simon, we see, is quick to judge the woman without realising where he has actually fallen short too. He didn't see that in condemning the woman, he was sort of, in a sense, rejecting his own salvation, that his own forgiveness that had been shown to him. And as a Pharisee, he was so worried about what was going on around him, what other people were thinking and doing, that he was unaware of his own brokenness and failure to treat Jesus well when he came into his house. And just the chapter before, in Luke chapter 6, Jesus, in teaching about judging others, says this: "Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, 'Brother, let me take the speck out of your eye,' when you yourself fail to see the plank in your own eye? You hypocrite, first take the plank out of your eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye." I quite naively, I think, looking back, always thought that I was okay, that I was quite good at forgiving and showing grace to other people, until I ended up in a situation that kind of properly tested that and definitely proved me wrong. A few years ago, I'd arrived home from Sheffield for Christmas, and my brother, who has given me permission to share this, sat me down with Mum and Dad and said that he needed to tell us something. And it turns out that, unknown to us really, over the couple of years before that, throughout sixth form, he had really struggled with peer pressure a lot. He had ended up kind of putting up this massive front, acting like someone very different to who he really was. He had lied to us on a number of occasions, sort of over months, about where he was, about who he was with, what he was doing. He'd struggled with drinking too much alcohol and had ended up in a very unhealthy relationship that nobody else sort of knew about at all, with a good friend of our family at the time. And by the grace of God, he then went on to start studying at Nexus, a Christian worship and Bible college, and he encountered God in a very real way there and began to turn things around, ending the relationship. He stopped drinking alcohol for a while. And a bit like the woman in Luke, he had repented. He'd knelt down at Jesus' feet and received total forgiveness and freedom. And praise God, he was totally transformed, and it's been amazing to see how God has been working in and through him since. But here he was, just before Christmas, telling me and Mum and Dad all of this, asking for my forgiveness for all the lies, for the hurt, and actually found it much, much harder to forgive than I had anticipated. For me, the news had come completely out of the blue. I just had no idea what had been going on. I felt really hurt by the lies, like my trust had been betrayed. But I think as I was kind of processing what I was feeling, what was particularly difficult is that I realised I was struggling with the fact that my brother seemed to receive Jesus' forgiveness and live in his newfound freedom so easily, while I was still kind of reeling from it all and struggling with this unforgiveness. And to be completely honest, I think what felt most unfair, what I actually felt quite resentful about at first, was that I sort of felt like I'd been waiting for a relationship, trying to do all the right things, was still single, while my brother had walked straight out of a very messy situation and relationship, and not long after into another relationship with a girl he had met at Nexus, who just seemed to be a really good match. But I think that's the upside down, the topsy-turvy world of God's grace, that we don't deserve it, and yet he lavishes his blessing on us. And like the man who owed the bigger debt in Jesus' illustration, I think my brother experienced a fullness of freedom and forgiveness that I hadn't yet grasped, a bit like Simon the Pharisee. And so it was a difficult few months of kind of wanting to forgive, thinking I had, that things had got a bit better, and then something would trigger all the feelings again, and I'd realised that I actually hadn't got to that place of forgiveness at all. Nearly a year later, I read a book called The Prodigal God by Timothy Keller, and he unpacks the parable of the prodigal son, particularly focusing on the unforgiveness of the elder brother. And I remember finishing it and just feeling very convicted of being a literal elder brother in this situation, or sister, I suppose. Timothy Keller talks about how when the elder brother refuses to go into the party and celebrate the return of the younger brother, he's refusing to choose the happiness of the father, refusing to choose what is God's best for him in that moment. And yet, despite his stubbornness, despite his unforgiveness, the father still showed grace in leaving the party to find the elder brother and to invite him in again. And I just began to realise that in kind of getting caught up about whether my brother should have been forgiven so easily or not, whether he deserved that, I hadn't stopped to recognise just how gracious God had already been to me all along. The fact that he had totally forgiven me, despite all my flaws and failures, despite the fact that I had been judgmental, that I was struggling to forgive. And it was only that I kind of, as I started to recognise God's grace and forgiveness afresh and receive that I was able to then fully forgive my brother out of that place. And 4.5 years on, a couple of weeks ago, my brother got engaged to the girl that he met at Nexus. And it's just such a testimony of God's redemption and his restoration in that situation. And I'm also very thankful that God has been at work in me, softening my heart so that I could truly celebrate and rejoice at the news when it happened. But I only found that freedom to forgive and extend grace when I realised afresh just how much God has forgiven me. And then once I realised that, I just couldn't withhold that from anybody else for any longer. So how do we kind of respond to all of this? One commentary that I was reading during the week says this: even though Jesus is a religious teacher, his teaching is not about religion. It is not about how to be more religious. It is not about how to gain God's acceptance. It is about a God whose acceptance of sinners the religious finds jarring. It is about a God whose love cannot be bought even by great acts of praise or mighty deeds of justice. It is about sinners who rejoice at the great forgiveness they have received and religious people who wish God were more religious. I think we see that Jesus turns the culture and the expectations of society completely upside down, and he invites us to do the same. He invites us to be a part of that. So I'd love to invite Matt and Sarah back up as we just take some time to respond to this. Verse 50 says, "Your faith has saved you. Go in peace." And so my question to sort of leave us with this evening is, do you truly know how much you are forgiven? Do you know the depth of grace that God has shown to you? And I'd really encourage you, as we respond in a moment, just to ask God to reveal his grace, his forgiveness to you again. Choose to accept that afresh, or maybe for the first time. And like the woman who started weeping at Jesus' feet before pouring out her worship, accept the invitation into Jesus' presence. And as we respond in a time of worship, receive his grace afresh. And then as we kind of accept God's grace for ourselves again, who do you need to extend that grace to in return? Who do you need to invite into God's presence? Are there people you have struggled to forgive because you feel like they don't deserve it, maybe? Maybe there are kind of people, situations that have come to mind as I've been speaking, and you want to ask God to give you a fresh perspective on his forgiveness for you so that you can extend that to other people. And if there's something that's particularly sprung to mind, there'll be a few of us around at the end. We would love to pray for you if that's something that you kind of want to see breakthrough with this evening. So we're just going to use the worship time now to respond as God's been kind of speaking to you, things that have come to mind. Feel free to use this time to stay seated, to kneel if you want to kneel, to come before God, to stand in worship, whatever you feel like you need to do to kind of respond to what God's been saying.